So I'm going to make a few assumptions before we get started in this tutorial. The first is that you will have administrator access to your WordPress website because we're going to be working in the theme editor. Two is that you are at least comfortable writing PHP and vanilla JavaScript. Even if you don't understand it fully, don't worry, we're going to go over it. And three, I want you to have a desire to try new things and learn to manipulate your website with just code because in the end, that's why we're here and it's so freeing to be able to do these things. So hope you enjoy it. Let's go. So I'm sure you're already familiar with what a reading bar looks like since that's why you're probably here in the first place. But just to show you what we'll be making together, the reading bar is this thin little bar at the top that shows you how far you have come in your reading and how far you have to go, just to give you a sense of space and time while you're reading. It's kind of cool, kind of elegant. I think it's pretty nifty. And this is what it's going to look like in our actual code. So for every post page, we are going to have WordPress insert this custom div container right underneath the body tag. It's got two other divs inside of it, a container and the progress bar itself. So we are actually going to be using JavaScript to inject these elements into our page. And I'll show you first how we'll get this styling set up, and then we'll jump into the actual functionality. So for styling, we have one class called Progress Header, and that is going to be the class for our main parent div. And what this one is simply going to be responsible for is keeping our reading bar pinned to the top of our page. You know, when we scroll down, it doesn't move, it stays with us. That's what this container is going to be for. And the styling for that one is going to look like this. So we're going to set the position to fixed. We'll set the top styling to 0, so right to the top of the page. Make sure the z-index is low so that it appears on top of everything else and nothing appears on top of it. The width will be 100%, and I just set a very plain background color. The next one, inside that one, will be a div called Progress Container, with the class of Progress Container. And what this one is going to do is actually style that gray bar. So when it's empty, it's going to just be a gray bar that looks like this. And the styling for that is going to look like this. It's simply going to have a width of 100%, same as before. We'll set the height to whatever we want it to be, and we're going to set a background color as that gray color. So that's all this one is going to do. And lastly, inside that container, we have our final div with a class of progress bar. And that's going to be that blue coloring that appears whenever we move. So I'm going to give it an ID as well called reading bar because we're going to need that when we write our JavaScript so we can target it and change its width dynamically. You notice it changes whenever I scroll. That's what we're going to need to do when we write our JavaScript. So that one going to have the same height as our progress container so that it looks like it's filling it up. It's going to have that blue color background, and we're going to set the default width to 0 because we want it to look empty when we first load a page. So that's it for styling. All of this, of course, lives in our main templates style.css sheet. So whatever theme you're using, just drop it in there. Make sure you save. And now when we view our page, I'll just show you it's going to look like this, but it's not going to do anything yet. So now we got to program the actual function part. So to do that, we're going to jump now into our theme editor's functions.php file, which looks like this, and you get here through appearance theme editor. So we're only going to have to write one function, and it's actually not going to be very much PHP because most of this is going to come from JavaScript. So the only thing we really need to do with PHP is make a container function, and we're going to have it work inside of our WP footer. So let's just make the function first. I'm just going to write function, give it a little name that means something to me. I can just spell. Okay, so I've got a basic function now, and I'm going to have WordPress add an action, and I want it to insert this function in the footer of whatever page I say. So to do that, I just need to use the built-in WordPress hook WP footer. And that's exactly where it will appear. I need to use my specific name that I made up. There we go. Okay, so now we're actually ready to write some JavaScript. So this is going to look a little weird, but we need to actually exit out of the PHP in our file so that we can go straight into JavaScript. Whenever you exit PHP, inside your functions PHP file, it is automatically interpreted as HTML. So you can basically think of it as just writing straight HTML. So here we have 3 divs that we're going to be making. Each one has a class, and the last one also has an ID. So we're going to use JavaScript to actually create these elements and apply these attributes to them. So if you've never used JavaScript before, no worries. A lot of this is actually quite intuitive. We just need to create a variable to hold each element so that we can add it later. So I'm just going to create a first variable here, and to our document, we are going to create an element, and it's going to be a div. And I'm going to just copy and paste this for each one just to save time. And now we can add our classes to them. So to our new element, H, we are going to access the class list and add to it. And we just in here give the name of the class we want to add, and that's of course progress header. Just like that. So we can do the same thing now for these other 2 divs, just like that. And now for our third div, before we finish up here, we have one other attribute to add, and that is the ID of reading bar. So we're going to set that attribute right now. And for that, we use the method set attribute. And it's going to be the ID attribute. And here we just give the name, which of course is reading bar. So that's it. That's how we make our 3 elements. Now the next part is going to actually be inserting them into the document itself, and we need to tell JavaScript where to do this. So if you remember back in our final product, we said we wanted to insert the first div, the parent container with the class of progress header, directly under the body tag. So this body tag is what we're looking for in our JavaScript, and it's what we're going to insert after it, our div. And then each progressive div is contained within the other. So that gives us the relative position of everything. And we're going to use that in our JavaScript right now. So this first one, progress header, we said was going to appear directly under the body class. So what we need to do is tell the document body, so you can actually directly reference the body tag. We need to insert a JSON element. This one right here. And this is a cool method. You give it 2 parameters. There are standard strings that you provide as a first parameter, and that tells you exactly where you want to insert the element. It's either before it opens, just inside of it, at the very end of it before it ends, or just after it. So one of those 4 positions. What we want to do is after begin. So that means after the tag is opened, right the very top of it. And the next parameter is the element obviously we want to insert. And that of course is this one we created up here, which we called H. And that's it. So it's kind of the same thing now for these other 2 divs. We want progress container to be after begin in this div. So we can do that. But instead of body, we need to reference our element up here. So what we're going to do is a query select. And of course, at this point in time in the script, it will have already been created and inserted, so we can reference it directly. It's going to be the div with the class of progress header. It'll be the only one. So we're going to use that selector, insert adjacent element after begin. And of course, we don't want H there, we want C. Now it's kind of the same thing again for our progress bar. We go down here, inside of our div with the class of progress container. So this is what we're targeting. We want to insert this element. So we're going to do that, change that to B, and that's it. So actually, with very few lines of code, we've created 3 divs, we've given them classes, this one we've even given an ID, and we've told JavaScript where to put them. So the last big part of this is actually going to be writing the JavaScript that does this dynamic changing of the progress bar. And as you can see when I scroll, the width is actually being calculated as a percentage. So this is kind of basic math that we're doing where there's going to be a total value that represents the complete height of our element. That would be this entire document in this case. And then we need something to register our actual position where we're scrolling from the top. So if the top is 0, every time we scroll, we're adding on to the value of our scroll position. So this might be 10, 20, 30, 40, out of a grand total that we need to figure out as well. So that's what we're actually going to do in JavaScript right now. All right, so let's get started writing this math equation. The first thing we're going to do is create a few variables. The first one is going to be, as we discussed earlier, our current scroll position, the one we need to grab whenever the user scrolls. So there's a couple of things I'm going to need to grab. I'm going to need to grab the position of the top of the body tag. And if that's not available, I'm going to grab the top of the HTML tag itself. Now the reason I have both of these in there with an or statement, this reads document body scroll top or document element scroll top, is because of different browser compatibility. I believe this one works for Safari and this works for Chrome, Firefox, and some of the other big ones. So that's just a compatibility thing. So the next thing we need to grab is the actual total height of our document. And we're going to actually have to do a little math I didn't mention earlier, because obviously when you're looking at the document, it's not like razor thin, it's not a 1 pixel at a time. Obviously there's some height to this, and up here you can see this height is 540. So we actually have to subtract that value from the total height of this document just to get a true representation of where the user is when they're looking at this. But that's super simple, and I'll show you right now. We're going to make a variable called height, and we're just going to need to grab the scroll height. And what this is, document element scroll height, is the entire height of the HTML element tag. So document element just represents the actual HTML tag, which will be your entire page. So now that we have that, we actually want to subtract the height of the user's viewport. So this value right here, 540, that tells us how high this viewport is. So we're going to subtract that from the total because that won't give us a true representation of where the user is without it. So we can do that with document element, and client height. How nifty is that? Methods for everything. So now we have our grand total that we're subtracting from, or I'm sorry, dividing from. So our user's position, total height, we divide this by this, we're going to get our percentage. So if we make a new variable called scrolled, we can divide the user scroll position, when scroll, by height. And if we multiply by 100, we get a percentage. And that's exactly how high we scrolled. So that's just the simple math of it. It looks complicated sometimes in JavaScript, but it's very basic math. Now we get to do the fun part of actually editing the width value of our progress bar. So this reading bar up here, we need to access its width attribute, and we need to change it dynamically every time the user scrolls. So to do this, we first need to target that element. So I'm just going to do a document get element by ID because we gave it a nice ID name. It makes it easy to target. Then we're going to access its style property, and the specific style property we want to access is the width. So now we need to set the width, and it's going to have to be dynamic. So what we're going to use is our new scrolled variable, and this is going to just print the number. So we need to actually put the percent sign in too, so that it actually goes in as a percentage. Okay, so we've got our dynamic changes all set up, but one thing we're missing, which is pretty important, is we have no trigger yet for when the user scrolls that all of this should be run. This needs to run every time the user scrolls. So we need an event listener that's going to pick up on whenever the scroll action happens. So just to make this nice, we're going to wrap this in a function. I'll just call it scroll read. All of this is going to live inside this function so that we can call it over and over every time the user scrolls. And there is a trigger for that. Whenever the window, which is the document window, scrolls, we're going to call a function, and that function is simply going to be our new function that we just created. So scroll read. So now we have this trigger, and every time a user scrolls, this function will be run, and this function will do exactly what we said it should do, and that's keep track of where the user is and then update their reading bar accordingly to their progress. So that's basically it. Now there's just a little bit of cleanup to do. So I'm just going to create a self-executing function. This is how it looks. Don't worry about how it works if you're not sure what this is about. But I want to put everything I just wrote inside this function. So this basically says as soon as the web page document is loaded, run everything in here. So now there's one last thing I'd like to do, and that is make sure that this function only runs on pages where I want the reading progress bar to exist. And I only want the reading progress bar to exist on post pages. So you know in WordPress, every page has a post type. If you look at the body class of a post page, you can see that there's a whole bunch of classes applied, and they tell you a little bit about what the page is about. So if you see single dash post, that's a type of class that tells you that this is a single post that you're reading, and there's specific functionality that I might personally want to have happen on pages that match this criteria. And that's exactly what I'd want for my reading bar. I don't want my reading bar on my home page, for example, so I only want to target these single post pages. And I can do that easily with PHP. So if I go back inside my PHP tag, just above this question mark and right arrow, I'm going to do an if statement. And this if statement has to wrap my entire script. So I'm just going to take this hanging little curly brace and I'm going to put it right inside this PHP tag so that it only runs all my script if the page is going to be that single post page. And I'm going to use some built-in WordPress functions for this. So there's one called isSingular, and that means that single part of the post page. So you see single, that's what I'm targeting. But I want more than that because that could apply to pages as well. I want the post. So inside this function, I want to supply an argument, and I want to say target just the posts. So now, if we save this, we should be ready to go. All right, update our file. Let's check it out. Looks the same. And there it is. When I scroll, it's loading my reading bar. How cool is that? So it works great. So I hope everybody enjoyed this tutorial. Please leave me some comments below if you have any questions about anything I did or didn't explain fully. I appreciate constructive feedback. So thanks so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time.